health, psychology, and human nature with André Sturesson. Hey friends, hope you're having a great day. Are you following me on Instagram and Facebook? Please go to Health, Psychology and Human Nature on Instagram or Facebook, or both for that matter, to get the latest episodes, inspiration and more. Please take a pause and go there. Also, if you like the episode, please share it with a friend, family member, or somebody else who you think might like it. Welcome back, friends, to another episode of Health, Psychology, and Human Nature, a science-focused podcast where we explore, learn, and improve our lives together. How does video games affect our well-being? In today's episode, Rachel will tell us about how video games, which is games on computer, on a console, or on the phone, affect our well-being and our mental health. But also how it teaches us a variety of skills, how it gives us a pause from our problems, and a lot more. We'll also get into addiction and playing as a child, and also if playing makes us aggressive. Rachel Kowert, she's a gamer herself with a Ph.D. from the University of New York. She has written and edited numerous scientific articles and books, two of which are A Parent's Guide to Video Games and Video Games and Wellbeing. The latter is the first book ever to be published on the positive effects of gaming. Friends, I really hope you enjoy today's episode. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about something that we both have in common today, which is games and video games.
Excellent. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. I'm really excited, actually. I think I would like to start off by asking you how games have affected your life.
Well, games have been a part of my life for my whole life. I remember getting a Nintendo when I was very young, and then Super Nintendo and PlayStation and et cetera, et cetera. For me, games have always been the center of my relationship with my older brother because it was something we could do together and not totally fight over it. And now it has turned into something that's my career. So video games have really kind of been at the center of everything for me.
Very interesting. That's actually what me and my brother, we also had the games in common. Yeah, well, we played like I think we played at least an hour a day, I think, when we were younger. So
for sure.
Yeah. I remember playing, the first Mario on Super Nintendo. It was great.
That is a great game, and it aged so well. I still play that sometimes.
Yeah, but you had the first Nintendo, right?
I did. I had the original, and it's funny because my uncle actually bought it for us, and his name is Peter Mario, and he convinced us when we were 5, 6 years old that he was the creator of Mario.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, and we believed him because we were 6, and yeah.
Of course, especially when his name is Mario, then I mean it's quite hard to. Wow, that's a lot of fun. Cool. All right, I think it would also be interesting to start off with what the general public or what the general people think about games and how games affect us.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the general consensus about video games still slants towards the negative. And a lot of that just comes from the fact that what gets attention in the news media are stories that slant towards the negative. So things like video games and violence and video games and addiction. In terms of how that reflects within the research, we're going to talk about that a little later. But I would say that still, if you do not have a lot of personal experience with video games, the general public generally believes them to be a negative influence on society.
Interesting. And today we're going to talk about perhaps if there are, or perhaps the negative sides of video games, but we're actually also going to talk about the positive sides. The positive side first.
Yay!
So I thought that it would be very interesting to know, like, Is there any science, and if so, what does the science say about how video games affect positive emotions and negative emotions?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research in this area, and it's kind of hard to summarize it in just a couple sentences. But just as an example, games can be very relaxing. They can reduce a sense of social anxiety when you're playing games with other people and you have that sense of social connectedness, which is even ever important now as we become more physically, isolated from each other. Games can unintentionally teach us a whole range of skills that are directly related to increased life satisfaction. So things like mindfulness or things like time management, creativity, leadership skills. All of these things are all intertwined into the whole range of things that games can teach us.
Interesting. I was also just before we head on, when we're saying video games, are we talking about games that are on the console and on the computer, or what are we talking about when we're saying video games?
Oh, that's a great point to make. So the angle that I take, I mean, I guess everybody could have a slightly different definition, is a video game is any game in a digital form. So it would be games on your phone, games on a console, games on a computer. It could even be digital versions of classic like tabletop games, so like digital versions of Monopoly or Sorry. All of these are kind of all encompassed in the general term video games.
All right, yeah, perfect. I was also intrigued to know, I mean, are there any randomized controlled trials when it comes to depression and anxiety and these kinds of disorders?
Yeah, so there are, I mean, and I wouldn't say so much so as randomized controlled trials. There is a study, I cannot remember the author now. I'll get back to you on that. There is a study that I did read about taking university undergraduates, and a third of them played single player games at home alone, a third of them played online games, and a third of them were asked to go to our arcade and play games. And over however much time it was, they looked at outcomes relating to depression and anxiety and social factors, etc. And online games had the best outcome. And the take home conclusion was being able to connect in a playful social space is related to positive mental well-being outcomes as well as positive relationship outcomes for those who you're playing the games with.
Right. So those games that were basically playing online games together with others, like role-playing games, or?
I think it was a role-playing game. I think it was EverQuest. This is kind of an old study, but yeah.
Right. But so, because that is something that I think is quite interesting, because I when I play games, especially if you don't play too long, like let's say you go in for 1 hour and play, then that is something that I feel really has really creates positive emotions in me. Usually, I mean, you can of course die in games and stuff, which also makes you mad, right? But I mean, in general,
Right.
in general, I mean, it's something that creates positive emotions. So it might seem plausible that it's something that could affect disorders like depression, for example, or anxiety.
Yeah, I mean, and even at its most basic level, I mean, games have an incredible power to reduce stress. You are doing something that's distracting you from your everyday stress and stressors. You are achieving things in game, whether it's solving a puzzle or killing a monster or whatever it might be. And yeah, you might also be dying, but you're also experiencing success at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's something that also really, really gets you right. It's really flow creating. I mean, it's really, let's say that you have a hard time in your life at that particular moment, and it's quite hard to think about if somebody is sick or something else when you're playing a game, because all your cognitive resources really needs to be in that game.
Correct. Yes. And flow is an important concept to talk about when we're talking about video games, because I think this is one of the things that really distinguishes them from other kinds of media. So for those who aren't familiar with flow, like you could say more casual, this is about being in the zone, right? So it's when you get into that intense concentration, and it happens when your skill level is perfectly balanced with the level of challenge. And good games and good design do this really well.
Right. And could you give an example for those that haven't heard about flow, so it becomes even more clear?
Sure. So When you're in a state of flow, you become hyper focused. This is when you say, I'm only going to play The Sims for an hour, and then you look up and 7 hours have passed. Or is that just me?
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
experience, a distortion of time and space, and you are internally driven to keep playing because you're having a good time. So yeah, that explains it, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I recently, like the last couple of years, I've been playing games on my cell phone, but I haven't really been playing a lot of games during the last couple of years. But recently, I started playing a little bit with a friend of mine, and I just got blown away about like how much flow I got from the game. I mean, I played for 2 hours, and it went by. It felt like we've been playing for perhaps half an hour or an hour, but not at all 2 hours. So I really, really felt the effect of the game there.
Yeah, exactly. It just kind of sucks you in. And a lot of times people might think of that as like a negative thing. I guess if your children are staying up all night and you don't want them to. But flow is one of the key things that makes games fun. And flow is also one of the key things that makes games such good tools for learning because they are so fun. You're intrinsically motivated to keep playing them.
Exactly. Yeah, they're really, really engaging. And
Yeah.
so what does the study say about, of course it's quite hard to lump all the games into one big pool, but still, like what does the study say about what does the study say about how they create flow?
Yeah, I mean, if a game is designed well, then a player will be in a state of flow pretty much from the very beginning. They're going to become hyper focused. And then as the in game tasks get more difficult, their skill level is going to increase because the game has taught them, they have, to use an education term, they provide scaffolding, right, to help them increase their skill at the same rate that the challenge of the game has increased. So if you think of a game, I'm trying to think of an example that's like just really difficult from the very beginning. Those are not games that are enjoyable, right? Those are games that just make you very, very frustrated. And that's because you're not in the right balance of level of challenge with level of skill. The challenge is too high and the game design has not properly given you the skills to navigate the challenge. So if you think of other games like, Mario is a great example. The worlds start off very simple. You jump on the little mushroom guy, you get your question mark, you get to the end. And then as the game's going, oh, now you're in the water. Now this is a new skill. You need to figure out how, the gravity works in the water. And then, oh, now these are platforms that fall. So as you progress, it gets more difficult and it's building upon the skills you already learned. If you started at the last level of Mario, it would be a totally different experience. It'd be very frustrating. You wouldn't really know what's happening and you wouldn't
Yeah.
have the ability to navigate it.
Exactly. It's not perfect. It's not perfect to go and meet Bowser straight away.
No, that's not going to end well for anybody. Well, maybe Bowser.
Yeah, probably Bowser then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And you also mentioned before that there are these different skills that can be learned from playing games. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So researchers have found video game play can promote a variety of skills and abilities, things like creative thinking, problem solving, time management, leadership skills. And this is not particularly surprising if you think about how video games require players to develop new solutions in a relatively short amount of time. So whether you're, exploring a new world or if you're solving a puzzle, the game challenges you to figure out how to overcome these challenges creatively in a short amount of time. So the more games you play, probably the more efficient you will become because you start to see different patterns. And then we can take these abilities and these complex problem solving skills and transfer them into our problem solving in our real lives, in our out of game lives.
That's interesting. Like, how do you measure that? Like, how do you measure these like the enhancement of these different cognitive and other abilities? And like, what are the things that you then try out in the real life?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on what you're looking at. So if it's things like visual spatial skills, there are like actual tests that are developed and they will, do a study where they have a group who doesn't play games and a group who plays, fast-paced action games for a certain amount of time and then give them the same kind of test at the end and they have found that people who play the games have shown greater increases in in these kinds of abilities. But for things like, creativity and leadership and multitasking, um, the fact that you are in these games and you are gaining experience doing these things translates into being able to take these skills out of game. For instance, if you are playing World of Warcraft and you want to go into a dungeon that requires you to lead a group of 10 people, the skills that you're using to organize, to assign tasks, to, quell the arguments, these are the same skills
Yeah.
that you would use
When
in
somebody doesn't
the
when
real
somebody
world.
doesn't heal somebody.
Right, and where somebody doesn't bring the right, potions, and it's a whole thing, or they're
Yeah.
late. The way that you're able to navigate these challenges in game then translate into out of game. I mean, you even see companies like big companies like IBM, which is like, a company you wouldn't necessarily associate with like young people and innovation. I wouldn't say it's more of a kind of an old school tech company. Even they actively advertise, like, do you play these kinds of games? I think that you have the skills that we need. And people are starting to put this on their resumes and their CVs for jobs as examples of how they successfully or unsuccessfully led, groups of people.
Yeah, but that's very interesting. So these kind of different games, like example, when you're playing World of Warcraft and you're leading people, then that really can be something that can be translated into the real world. That is something that really makes sense as well.
Yeah, and I think another important point here is these kinds of skills like leadership skills and problem solving. This is unintentional learning, right? These games are not developed to teach us leadership skills and problem solving skills, but we are learning them in the course of playing these games. And that's another reason that goes back to why games are such good learning tools. Because if I sat my daughter down to play a game called like Leadership 101, right, she wouldn't want to play that.
Yeah.
But World of Warcraft is very exciting and very engaging, and through playing it, we're learning a wide variety of things.
Yeah, I mean that must be the challenge when you create games that are supposed to help somebody to develop certain skills that people or children might not actually like playing the games, and then they won't play them if they're not like
Right.
forced to, kind of.
Exactly. I mean, I remember when I was a kid playing like typing games and like math games that were very much just like addition problems on a screen, and those were not, very fun.
One thing that also, like, when we're talking about World of Warcraft, for those that don't know what World of Warcraft is, this is this big game where you play with a lot of other players in the world, and you're on like two different sides. So you're either on the kind of the good side or the bad side, kind of. Or would you say that that's correct? Good side or bad side?
Yes.
Yeah,
it is correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And what I find very interesting about this is that it seems really to tap into human nature. I mean, what we do in these games basically is that we cooperate, we develop different skills, we hunt together, we solve different quests. I mean, we fight enemies and stuff like that. Do you believe that that is why these kinds of games has become so popular, because they're really tapping into human nature?
Yeah, I mean, I really think that's part of it. There's this idea that we're motivated to engage in activities that kind of hit these three basic motivations. The first is a sense of autonomy, the idea that we are free to make choices. The second is a sense of competence, the idea that we are capable of completing our tasks in front of us. And the third is being related or connected to each other. And good games tap on all three of these. They give us the autonomy to explore, like World of Warcraft is a great example, to explore the game world. They give us a sense of competence. They give us challenges that we can overcome. Some are easier, some are more difficult. And then the relatedness component comes with playing with other people. So in this sense, it's kind of the perfect little cocktail of what kind of taps into us as humans and our deep-seated motivations in life.
Exactly, and that theory there is the self-determination theory, right?
It is. That is correct.
Yeah, so would you say that that is kind of one of or the leading theory when it comes to psychological needs in humans?
It is one of them for sure, and it is definitely the center point when talking about how games meet the psychological needs. And it's used very extensively in user research, for example, for game companies looking how to develop games that are enjoyable.
Interesting. So the self-determination theory is actually used when games are being developed.
Correct.
Huh. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, you want to make games that are fun, right? So
Yeah, of
if this
course.
is how games are fun, and this is, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I remember myself. I was playing a role-playing game called Tibia when I was younger, which is kind of like World of Warcraft, only with the graphics of Nintendo, like the first Nintendo, kind of.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and it was. I mean, it didn't look very good, but it really tapped into these things. I mean, when you gained levels and you made friends and there was wars and I mean there were thieves and there was like heroes, and I can really remember also that all of these different people that you met, they were kind of, I mean, their in-game character was kind of like a mirror of how they were in real life. So some people just wanted to just only hunt. Some people just hung around and did crazy stuff, and some people just stayed at home and just talked, kind of. So I think it's also
Right.
it also says something about who we are, I think, when we play these games.
Oh, absolutely. It is a reflection of either who we are in our daily lives, who we want to be. There's even research showing that people try on different identities and different roles in games. There's a whole field of research looking into avatar relationships and how the way we behave in games reflects the way we may or may not behave in our everyday lives. It is super interesting area of research.
Really, really interesting. Like, what do you find most interesting about that?
I'm really interested in reading about people who are trying on different personas in games, because when I played like World of Warcraft, for instance, I was very much just who I am here.
Yeah.
In the game. I was always, oh, do you need help? I was a resto shaman. I was a resto druid. Like I was very much like, let me help you, like a
Yeah.
classic psychologist.
Yeah.
But I find it interesting to me the people who go the complete opposite, because it's kind of like a safe space that's easily accessible. It's semi-anonymous. I mean, you could be fully anonymous for the most part if you want to, and they could just try on different things. Like, I'm going to be a very aggressive warrior, and I'm going to be, a very motivational leader, whatever it might be. And it gives people an outlet to have that role and have those experiences that they may not have otherwise. It's the stories I read about where it's like the 12-year-old in their house is leading groups of 40-year-olds through dungeons.
Yeah.
Right? It's an experience they would
That's
normally never get to have.
That is a really, really interesting thought. Exactly. There's some like really, really hardcore 12-year-old who's just leading an entire group of 40 people, where people are actually twice that person's age.
Exactly. And they're listening to them and they're competent at doing it. And, it's really cool. And even just like connecting with people on the other side of the world as well. Like, I wouldn't normally have a conversation with a 12-year-old leading, a group in a raid, but think of all the things you could learn and experience from the older people and from the younger people if you're not judging them based on these characteristics that you would normally judge them if you were, walking down the street and interacting with them.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's very true.
I'd be like, you can't lead me through a dungeon. You're 12.
Yeah.
But maybe they can.
Exactly. And then you didn't listen, and then you died.
Exactly. Right. I always brought the potions. Don't you worry.
Yeah, that's good. Cool. So when it comes to well-being, what would you say? Like, what are the where do we see the best effects of how games can improve the well-being of people?
I mean, it's kind of hard to say the best. I mean, my specific area of interest has always been the social connections that you can make through games. From the beginning of online gaming, there's really been this assumption that the social connections you make online are somehow weaker or less valuable than the social connections you make at school or at work. And my research has looked into whether that is a true statement or not. And it turns out it is very much not a true statement. And that the friendships and the social connections you make through games can be really valuable friendships that are viewed as real as any real world friendship can be. And there's even some extra advantages to online friendships. For instance, you have a sense of anonymity. I can talk to you about, my best friend at school if I'm having a fight with them, and it's not going to go through the school and come back around that I was like saying mean things, whatever it might be. And in that sense, I think that games are exceptional because they provide a social space with a shared activity. So it's creating this sense of connectedness and camaraderie like you would have with team sports, but with the addition and extra bonuses of being semi-anonymous, and having this mediated space in which to connect.
Interesting. So what you're saying basically is that your research suggests that a friendship that is made through a game is as important for your well-being as somebody who you're having a friendship with in real life.
Correct. And for some people, it could be even more so. So for people who are geographically isolated, people who live in really small towns, right, who don't really have a lot of people to choose from to be friends who have shared interests, the internet provides access to millions of people who have the same shared interests, whether it be video games or Dungeons and Dragons or whatever it might be. It's also my research has found that it's particularly advantageous for people who are shy. So people who might have a hard time interacting in kind of real-time, face-to-face social situations. Interacting through games provides a range of social accommodations, right? It provides a shared activity, which is a topic of conversation.
Yeah.
You can communicate using text, which gives you a chance to really craft what you're saying, and you don't have to speak fluidly like you do if you were standing, at school talking with your friends, and a whole host of other things.
When you've done these studies, what aspects of well-being is it that you've been looking at?
In my work specifically, I've been looking at perceptions of social connectedness and friendships. There is also research, though, that has looked at depression and anxiety. Those are kind of the two big ones that have been looked at. And while the studies aren't necessarily perfect, right, they're not laboratory studies where every variable is being considered. But generally, the consensus is that playing video games with others and having that fun social outlet to connect with others is generally associated with reductions in depression, reductions in perceptions of loneliness, and reductions in social anxiety.
Yeah.
But take that with a grain of salt because those aren't like perfectly crafted studies.
Yeah, perfect. But it seems like it has an effect then.
Correct.
And especially what you said earlier there, where when somebody is, if let's say that you're living in a really small town with a couple of hundred people and you have perhaps no one there that you're actually getting along with, then especially for that person, when you don't have any other alternative, then for that person probably then games really can become something that really can enhance their life, I think.
Absolutely. And when I was younger, I always played video games, but I'm going to say there were like 0 other females in my tiny town in Texas that I grew up in that also played video games. And when online gaming emerged, when I was in college, is really kind of when it got big. It was like a whole new world, like just like in that song in Aladdin. It was like, who are all these women who also like playing games?
Did you sing that song then as well when you met all those friends? You're like,
no, in my head I did. I have a terrible singing voice, but yeah, it's pretty incredible the technology and what it can do to bring people together.
Yeah, for sure. I was thinking also about because, as we said in the beginning of this conversation, games also has a reputation of perhaps not being good for people. So I would like to know what you think. Are there any problems with games, and if so, like what are the biggest problems with games, you think?
So I think the two biggest that at least people tend to talk about as being the problems with games is going to be the first one about violent video games and their effects, and the second one is probably gaming addiction. Taking on the first one, so there's been a lot of studies that look at the effects of violent video games. The first kind of thing to point out here is these studies are also not very well designed, because what's considered a violent video game that has whatever kind of effect in study 1 and study 2, the same game is being used as an example of an action game that has positive effects,
right?
On teaching
yeah.
visual spatial. So, there's a lot of methodological problems we can talk about. But if we just take the broad strokes, generally speaking, there have been studies that have found if you play violent video games, you show small increases in aggression directly after playing the game. Now, what this means is I go into a laboratory, I'm given some kind of test. A lot of times it could be a word completion test that just says like KI blank blank, and I put KISS, all right, kiss. Then I play 15 minutes of Grand Theft Auto, which is considered a violent game in all these studies. That one's used pretty much always. And then they give me a post test where I see KI blank blank, and I put in KILL. Okay. So that would be an increase in aggression. So these are the studies we're talking about. This does not translate into violent behavior in any scope. Like by saying a game leads to increases in aggression is not saying that games contribute to violent crime. In fact, there's zero evidence that playing violent video games contributes to violent crime. And the one example I like to give, we could talk about it ad nauseum, but is that over the last 20, 30 years, video game consumption of what's considered violent video games has increased, while crime among youths, so people who are under the age of 18, who are thought to be, one, the most susceptible to media messages, and two, have the most time to play violent video games, crime among this group has significantly reduced. So that's kind of my soapbox about violent video games. In terms of video game addiction, this is a pretty controversial topic as well. The World Health Organization has designated gaming disorder as an independent diagnosable clinical disorder, but the American Psychological Association has not yet recognized it as so. So there's still a bit of debate as to whether or not there is something unique about games that make them addicting. If you look at the research as it stands now, I would say there is not any evidence to suggest that there is something unique about games as compared to any other media that would make them particularly addicting. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that some people are absolutely using games in a disordered way, in a way that is having negative influences in their lives. But the difference here is that researchers are not saying it's the games that are causing this. It's more the games are a tool that is trying to mitigate something else underneath, whether it's depression, whether it's environmental stress, whether it is some other treatable mental health challenge that is then kind of showing itself in problematic gaming.
Okay, so it's not the game per se. The game is more a tool, and then the underlying problem is you being depressed of perhaps, I don't know, so one or many different reasons.
Correct. And that's really important distinction, because if you're bringing somebody in for treatment and you say it's games that are the problem, that's going to be a totally different treatment plan than depression is the problem. Right.
Right. So it's about finding the root cause of the depression, and not the symptoms. So the symptoms more being playing the games then.
Correct. And you know, the games could also be a tool that's a positive tool to help somebody cope with the issues that they're having. So if somebody is feeling depressed and isolated and socially anxious and lonely, the games, they might be playing a lot of them because the games are providing those needs for them. So if you say my child has a problem with games and you just take the games away, you could, one, not be treating what the underlying issue actually is, and two, you could be making it worse because games could be the tool that they were using to help cope with that kind of self-medication.
Right. But could it be also that when somebody's playing a game that they do not try to handle like the root cause, kind of like a fleeing behavior or something like that, if you understand what I mean?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Like escapism, absolutely. I think it's important to note that people can use games in a problematic way. And if playing games is causing detrimental problems in all areas of your life, physical, social, occupational, educational, whatever it might be, then it's time to look at it. Okay, why are we playing these games? What is the root cause? And trying to get a sense of it. Absolutely.
But that is also interesting. So how do you know what are the symptoms if you're not having a good relationship with your gaming?
Yeah. I mean, the TLDR, the too long didn't read, would be a detrimental impact over an extended period of time. So 6 months, I believe, is what the World Health Organization suggests in every aspect of your life. So your physical health is suffering, your social health is suffering. Maybe you're not interacting with other people. Maybe you're not going to social engagements that you used to previously go to. You're feeling more anxious or more depressed or more lonely. You are not performing in your job. You are not performing in your school. You're not completing homework. It has to really be all encompassing. Every aspect of your life is suffering. And the one kind of consistent thing that it's linked to is playing games too much, problematic gaming. But again, if that is the instance, my advice, of course, would be seek a professional help. But keep in mind that there is more research to suggest there's something else driving this behavior, and it's not the games as a technology that is the root of the problem.
Okay. All right. So I'm just trying to get my head around this. So physical life, social life. So it's basically that your health is deteriorating because of your gaming, and you're not going out with friends, you're not going out with family. So you said so that you can play the game. Is those that kind of could you give some examples just so we understand like how?
Yeah. There's a wonderful South Park episode have you
Okay.
seen it? Called Make Love Not Warcraft. And in it, the boys of South Park start playing World of Warcraft. And over the period of the episode, they become significantly more overweight. They stop eating healthy foods. They stop going to school. They stop talking with their friends who are not playing the games at all. They're not doing like their sports activities anymore. So it'd be that kind of behavior, but for an extended period of time, so at least 6 months. So the reason I keep stressing the extended period of time is because there is a difference between games being used in a prolonged way that's problematic and just increased engagement over the short term. For instance, when I got Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the arcade game, for Christmas, when I was younger, I played so many hours of that on Christmas break. Now, I was not hanging out with my neighborhood friends because I was loving the game. But after those 2 weeks, that was it. I was back at school and everything was fine. So it's about it being more of like a lifestyle change than just I got this really cool, fun game and I'm on holiday right now, so I'm going to play a whole bunch of it.
Yeah, I think so. So it's basically, or not basically, but so it's really about like how is your life in general and what happens when you play the game. For this example, for example, then probably you were like high on life when you were at home playing the game, and your life was probably good or okay, anyways. So perhaps that is perhaps the important part then.
Yes, right.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really about how somebody's life is in general, and why you play the game. I mean, for you here also, you're playing the games because you want to, because it's something that like gives you a lot of positive emotions and excites you. And for somebody else, it might be that you're running away from loneliness or running away from negative feelings, for example.
It could be. And escapism, we call that escapism, in and of itself is not necessarily a problem, but it can, become one if you're unable to function in the other areas of your life that you need to function in.
Okay, so why is it not a problem, or why can't it be a problem?
Oh, because escapism, everybody needs to escape from the day-to-day now and then. For instance, as we speak now, the coronavirus is spreading, and people are socially distancing and self-isolating. And if you watch this 24-hour news cycle, at least for me, that is having definitely a detrimental impact on my mental well-being. So being able to sit down and kind of escape into the problems of Luigi in Luigi's Mansion 3, which I am now playing, is wonderful, and it's much needed, and it's providing, levity and a distraction from the day to day. So in that sense, escapism is a stress reduction for me, and it gives me just a chance to kind of take a break from it all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that really makes sense. So it's more, so it's like instead of you going out taking a jog, or instead of you're sitting and reading a book, you're doing something you like, which makes you feel good, and which makes you pause from in this example, the coronavirus.
Exactly. And that is a perfect example with the book reading, because book reading is a perfect example of escapism. We escape into other worlds. We escape into Middle Earth. We escape into Westeros, and that's never really framed as something negative. But when we talk about like I'm escaping, into Azeroth in World of Warcraft, they're like, ooh,
Yeah.
that can't be good. But it's it's the same idea. It's entertainment. It's media.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, I mean, a lot of people, I'm just guessing here, but probably it's a lot of older people that think that it's a big problem for those that are younger, probably. Or would you agree with that? Or
I would say it's disproportionately, I think people who did not grow up with video games tend to have more negative views, but there are also a surprising amount of people my own age, but again, it's about lack of experience, that are very much like, my kids are not playing any video games. I don't care that all their friends are playing Fortnite. I know games are bad and they're not playing them, which is just not true. But so yeah, I would say it's a lack of information and just, a perpetuation of the moral panic around games that's been here since arcade games. It's been here since the first home consoles. There's just a fear around this new technology. And if you don't have experience with it, and if you're not familiar with, the research, now we have 20, 30 years of solid research looking at video game effects that largely dispels these fears.
right. Another thing that I would like to talk with you about is how old you're, like how old you should be when you should start playing. So what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I will say my daughter is 5, and she has had, and she got a tablet with games on it, I would say, when she was 3. My son is 2.5, and he plays on the tablet as well. Games can be great tools for learning letters, for learning numbers, like even for younger kids, PBS kids. PBS is public broadcasting channel in the United States. They produce a lot of educational content, and it's fantastic. And I absolutely utilize it as much as I can, but also in moderation. So it's just one of many things that we do. I would say that there's no reason that you should necessarily say, no, you're too young, you cannot engage with this technology. It's more about bringing the technology in as like, okay, we're going to practice letter writing with holding a pencil. Okay, now we're going to try something a little more dynamic. Let's do letter recognition in this Sesame Street game. Now we're going to go do something else. I am very much a fan of use what we have at our disposal. So I absolutely think it's, for me and my kids, every family is different. I don't want to tell you what to do. But I definitely utilize games and educational apps as young as 2.5, 3 years old.
But do you also allow? I don't really mean to just go into you yourself in your life. I think just thinking about your thoughts about it. But do you also allow your children to? I mean, have an iPad and then play for themselves for longer periods of time, and what's your thought about that?
So again, I am very much of the everything in moderation. My daughter loves Minecraft so much. She loves Minecraft.
Yeah.
So she definitely goes off on her own and plays Minecraft. But for me, the biggest concern about games for me is online stranger danger, honestly. So she can play Minecraft, but we bought her a realm where nobody's in it except her neighborhood friends. So I don't have the fear that she's interacting with content that's inappropriate, with people who are inappropriate. I think that the younger they are, the more we really have to be aware of the connectedness and online people aspect of playing games, especially now because almost all games are connected online somehow. Even if it's on your console, right? You're within a network, a communication network. So you have to, as a parent, really stay on top of online security and making sure that they're not doing your best to make sure they're not exposed to things that are inappropriate for their age.
Yeah, exactly. Because a thought that I have about, I've seen, I don't have any kids of my own, but I've seen my friends' kids and others. It just seems like as an iPad or a smartphone when you're really young seems to really, grab the focus of a baby and a child in a way that I feel sometimes can be a bit frightening, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, and we have to keep in mind, like, developmentally, they're not as good at self-regulating as adults are. So, if you think about, if you want, I remember we were talking, you said you have background in neuroscience. Our visual stimulation, like our eyes never tire of visual stimulation, right? Is we never have fatigue from, looking at fireworks or looking at a burning fireplace, and it's because our eyes just don't tire of being stimulated. So, if you think about that, and they have the iPad. It's dynamic, it's interesting, it makes noise, it's bright. Of course, they're going to want to play it all day long, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Of course they are. So it's up to the parent to make sure that everything is in moderation. Just like I say me, just because I played The Sims all night long as an adult is example that even as adults, right, we get sucked in to that, but we're better at regulating, and children are not. So I agree. I do not let my children watch videos on their tablets because I feel like that is also kind of, they get really sucked into kind of a videos on a loop. Then
Yeah.
they will sit there all day long, and that's not great. I want to use games as a tool for education, as a tool for entertainment, and not just something to like mindlessly zone out in, much like our parents thought we did when we watched television, except this is kind of
Yeah.
taken a bit to the next level because of the interactivity that's involved with it when it comes to games anyway.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was doing an interview with another researcher called Francis, who's doing research about touch and like the importance of touch
Mm.
when we're younger. And I just feel like there's also something to us. I mean, us as humans, that we have these inbuilt systems for. I mean, for touch, for example, for relating to others, and all of these things. Which I mean, if you're really young and you're really into your basically just looking at your smartphone or phone or something like that, I just feel like it could possibly be detrimental to the development of a baby and a child and a young child.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think it is. I mean, I'm going to say that's not my area of expertise, but children are developing creatures, and we know that there is research looking at the importance of touch and interaction with their primary caregiver. And if they are doing a solitary activity for a significant amount of time during the day at a really young age, I mean, I feel like there's got to be research out there that shows that that's not the best conditions for which to develop,
Yeah, probably not.
especially when you're learning so much about social interaction and connectedness. Your attachment is forming at a young age, which is highly reliant on the interactions you have with your primary caregiver. So yeah, everything in moderation, and every family is different. I would say an iPad is not a babysitter, but it could be something that you engage with your children with. Like I said, my daughter plays a lot of Minecraft. She plays, but my husband and I play with her.
Yeah.
So it's not like she's sitting in the corner playing Minecraft for an hour a day. She's sitting with daddy. She burned down his house the other day. It was very dramatic. But I mean, they got to do it.
Dad.
She
Yeah.
put lava on the floor and
Yeah.
didn't know it was going to catch the house on fire.
Yeah,
Protest, don't put lava on the floor.
I thought it was her dad who did it, and she didn't.
No, no. My husband was like, "Why is my house burning?" Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
That was
exactly.
fun.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, as a tool, I think it's great. I mean, for and I remember myself. I think we got the Super Nintendo when I was 5, I think, or 6 or something like that, and I can still remember how much fun it was to play. And back then, I mean, I think it was pretty much like your story, that we played a lot when we got it, but then it was played on and off in different
Yeah.
periods of our life. I was also thinking, perhaps, if you like, do you have this? This might be hard, but also when it comes to babies and children and adolescents, like, do you have any recommendations of like how much that is good for somebody to play?
Yeah, so there's no magic number. I'm sorry, parents listening. There's no magic number. I would say you know your children best. And if you believe that it is becoming a problem, like for me in my house, I would say when I tell my daughter to turn off the tablet and she yells at me, that means it's too much. And then it gets taken away. And then she doesn't get it for a couple of days because it should not be like that. It should just be one of many things that she does. It shouldn't be, like My Precious and Lord of the Rings, which I
Yeah,
feel like it gets
yeah,
to it sometimes. Um, So yeah, I would just say everything in moderation. It doesn't even need to be, every day, or it could be 30 minutes a day. Whatever you set boundaries for your children and you just stick to them. And this is also a good primer for teaching them generally good screen time habits. My other second piece of advice is if we are limiting our children's screen time, we should also be limiting our own screen time. So it's really hard to tell your child she can only play on the tablet for 30 minutes if you are looking at your phone 20 out of 24 hours a day.
For sure.
So yeah, I would just say you come up with a family plan for how screens should be used as tools in your family, in your household, and move on from there.
Yeah, perfect. I've also seen that you are working at a cool place. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about. Is it named Take That, right?
It's Take This.
Take This. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. It's named Take This. Can you tell us a little bit about Take This and what you do there and.
Sure. So Take This is the first nonprofit mental health organization to form that works specifically within the gaming industry and video gaming communities. I am their research director, which means I lead all of the research projects. We also have a clinical director, Dr. B, who does more kind of outreach for patients and parents also who are interested in talking more on the clinical side of how games can be used both positively and negatively. We do a lot of things. We provide a lot of resources to the community. We have a presence at conferences, so these very large kind of video game conferences. We host what we call the AFK room, which is a nice quiet space where you can go to get away from the hustle and bustle of the show floor, which is always a welcome kind of escape. Talk about escapism.
Yeah.
Conferences that can have like thousands of people in them. But yeah, so you can learn more about us at takethis.org. We post a lot of content just about games and their impact on our mental health and the gaming industry and ways in which we can better the industry and that sort of thing.
Interesting. And I also saw that you've written a couple of different, or at least 2 books. Can you perhaps just give us a glance of those as well?
Sure. So I've published a few books specifically focusing on video game effects. No surprise. A couple years ago, I published a book called the Video Game Debate, which is an edited book that looks at all of the major debates surrounding video games and kind of summarizes the research in that particular area. So addiction, aggression, learning, social outcomes, all of those kind of things. And when I wrote this book, I remember thinking like, this is going to be a great resource for parents. It turns out it's a great resource for college students because parents don't have time to read a 300-page book, which I totally relate to now. I did not have kids at the time. So a couple years later, I published a book called A Parent's Guide to Video Games, which is basically the Cliff's Notes version of the Video Game Debate. And then this January, I published a book called Video Games and Wellbeing, which is similar to the other books, but it focuses on the positive aspects of games and the various things that we are unintentionally learning that can have a positive impact on our well-being through playing games. And it's actually the first book that's ever been published specifically focusing on the positive aspects of digital gameplay.
That's very cool, I think. If somebody would like to learn more, I mean, you're really interested. If somebody would like to learn more about the research about how games have a positive effect on us, where can people find more? Like, are there any books, web pages, something else like that?
Yeah, well, there's my book. You can buy my book. No. We do a lot of resources on takethis.org. We focus a lot on the positive and the negative. There's also a great organization called Games for Change. They also promote a lot of different, they have a lot of blog posts and resources relating to that. And if you want to learn more about my work specifically, I have a website. It's kowert.com, and the information on there about like my books and what I'm currently researching and looking at and that sort of stuff.
Perfect. Okay, so now we're on to the very last question, which is what would you say? What is the take-home message from this conversation?
I would say when it comes to the effects that video games have, if you take the biggest, broadest stroke, it's more good than bad, and at the very least, it's neutral. So video games don't need to be something that we're horribly afraid of. They can be great tools for a whole range of things for all ages.
Rachel, it's really been an honor talking to you, and I would really like to say thank you for all the work that you've done and for spreading this knowledge out there. I think it's great, and I mean, you even mentioned that it's the first book, so thank you for your work, and keep up the good work, and thank you for coming here and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care.
You too.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Friends, I really need your help. I'm trying to get the podcast out there. So I was wondering if you could help me by leaving a positive rating and a review on your Apple device or the podcast player that you're using, as well as subscribing to the podcast. That really helps getting the show more visible on iTunes and other players. And if you don't know how it's done, then YouTube has a lot of great videos, so you can search there. All right, that's it. Take care. This podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, including the giving of medical advice. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.